In this video, we'll talk about Farewell to Manzanar, chapters 8 through 11. And in chapter 8, we now have Papa living immersely into the family, and his return kind of signifies a shift in their family dynamics. And in chapter 8, we see that it starts with this very dark tone regarding his return. And in fact, on page 59 in my book, in the very first paragraph, it says that it was not the other things in the room was not what crowded it. It was Papa himself, his dark, bitter, brooding presence. And we see that he begins to continue his alcoholic habit that we found out about in chapter 6, and that he makes this homemade still, kind of like a bootleg moonshine that he creates through the extra rice and the fruit that Mama brings to him, and he creates this, and he's just constantly drunk. And as he's constantly drunk, he makes like groaning sounds like a demon in a kabuki dream. He terrifies everyone. No one could pacify him. Mama only got threats and abuse. And then it gets to a point where we see him become violent, and we'll see that towards the end of the chapter. But the main thing that we see here, like question number 2 asks, the rumor of the camp is that, on my book it's page 61, the rumor was that as an interpreter, he had access to information from fellow isseis that he later used to buy his release at Fort Lincoln. And so people are spreading these rumors that the only reason why he was released earlier than the other people at Fort Lincoln in the prison is because he basically became a traitor. And that's the title of this book, is Inu, or this chapter is Inu, which means dog. And Gene initially thinks that it's because of his drinking habit, but it also has a secondary meaning, which is a traitor. Collaborator or informer. And so he's being accused of being an informer for the American people. And so he's just filled with shame, and we talked about this in the previous chapters. He lives off of this creed of honor and shame, and now this whispered charge added to the shame of everything that had happened to him, and it was simply more than he could bear. He did not yet have the strength to resist it. He exiled himself like a leper, and he drank. So that's really the source of his drinking problem. And so when we see his violence and his rage, then he gets to a point where he actually physically assaults Mama, and he is about willing to beat her and kill her. He says, in fact, I'm going to kill you this time. And Mama, very, kind of has resigned and said, go ahead, if that will make you happy. And so you can imagine Gene just watching this scene and being scared and knowing that there were times, and this is question number 2, or question number 1, that there were times where they had fought, but it was always private. On page 63, it said that there had always been doors to keep something private. Here there were no doors, nothing was private. And so we see Kyo kind of run into the room, and he tells Papa to stop, and he punches Papa square in the face, but runs away as a result. And it's a very shameful act. And so Kyo apologizes after 2 weeks of hiding. And the third question asks, how can it be seen as heroic? And then, that's a fair question to ask. Like, well, can we even see that as heroic? Well, one thing we have to keep in mind is Papa's culture and his pride, his honor and shame culture background, and the fact that his son has returned to apologize for this great offense, this bringing of shame. And so it can be seen as heroic because Kyo is understanding Papa's culture and kind of able to placate him in that way. And so then we get to chapter 9, where tensions are really running high, and there's charges of disloyalty, right? In the first paragraph, it talks about that was such a huge source of shame and dishonor for Japanese people to be called disloyalty. And so as tensions brew, it leads to this December riot, which is a year later, and everything becomes a boiling point. And it really results in these public meetings where there's constant talks of wanting to have higher wages, better food. Even people are talking about open revolt, patriotism, common sense, wholesale return to Japan. And sometimes it results in shouting matches. And so we can see that these are all the causes that have led to this riot. And I mean, it makes sense. Like, these people have been living here for a year and have been living in these horrible conditions, and most of them are American citizens. And to be um, living this way, man, it's intense. And then we have Fred Tayama, who's the leader of the JACL, Japanese American Citizen Leagues, and he was beaten by 6 men, and they were thinking that it was because he was working as um, a working as an informant for the American government. And when they found out the person who had been kind of organizing the beating, this young cook he was arrested, and that's what really triggered the riot. And then we see Sugar disappearing from the camp as another example of the tensions rising, and it's kind of symbolic because it's no longer sweet. We no longer see any goodness, and sugar represents kind of the sweetness, the goodness of food, but now that's disappearing in camp. And we see then in page 69 that during these riots, tear gas is shot out, and the mob is swirling frantically, and then soldiers begin to open fire. And that clears the street. Only the dead and injured remain. 10 were treated in the hospital for gunshot wounds. One young man was killed on the spot. Another 19-year-old died 5 days later. And so this riot becomes deadly. And this riot is really the result of all the tensions that have kind of occurred in camp. And then we see in chapter 10, like, it's called an aside, the reservoir shack, an aside, meaning kind of a look away from Jean and her as a main character. Now it goes to her brother-in-law, Kaz. And this whole incident, they have kind of this special privilege that even though there's this riot occurring and everyone's supposed to be in their barracks and they're not supposed to be leaving, this small crew was allowed to go because they needed to have 24 hours operations going so that water could keep moving into the camp. And so this small crew goes out to the shack to make sure that the water is going to where it needs to be. But then these soldiers come to the barrack or to the shack, and they have guns at their face. Like, literally, there's a gun. In page 71, it says there's a gun against his cheek. And they're, yelling at them, all right, you Japs, up against the wall. And they're saying, what are you guys doing here? And, Kaz is trying to say, oh, we're the reservoir crew. But the soldiers say, no one's supposed to leave the camp. You know that. And they are suspicious because they have these hatchets that are necessary for their job, and they think that they're part of the insurrection, and there's just this sense of fear, and it's just unfortunate because they're treated poorly and treated this way even though they were doing their jobs. And then chapter 11, yes, yes, no, no, we get to a really contentious part of the story, which is the loyalty oath. And she starts with the actual statements that they were supposed to sign either yes, yes, or no, no to. And there's this huge back and forth for how the people of Manzanar ought to respond to this loyalty oath. And like I mentioned before, this sign of disloyalty is what really causes this tension because people, especially the issei, the first generation, they don't want to denounce their heritage, their homeland, but they also don't want to be disloyal to America. And so there's just this really sense of tension of, the shame and honor culture that exists here in Manzanar. And so we see Woody, the oldest son, kind of going back and forth with Papa and kind of saying how they ought to um, sign this loyalty oath. And Woody is like, well, I'll say yes, yes, and I'm willing to fight in the war. And Papa's like, okay, well, yeah, I mean, it's probably best to answer yes, yes, but we need to talk about this. We need to figure out how we're going to fight for justice and make sure that everyone's treated fairly. And it's just a difficult tension because Woody, you can understand Woody, he was born in America, he's a nisei, and Papa, he's an issei, and he's showing that it's not that simple. And we can see that if they do answer no, no, then what would happen is they would be sent to a relocation camp where they would have to either denounce their Japanese heritage or be sent back to Japan. And it's like, we don't want to do that. Um, and those are the three narrow gates that they're trying to escape. First is the infantry to try to fight the all Nisei combat regiment that was created, which later would become the 442nd, which was a very highly decorated um, regiment in World War II. The second gate was to go back across to the Pacific. That's if you answered no, no. And then there's a third option called relocation, where they would allow these intern citizens to go to other places in the country and work. And this was a great option that a lot of people wanted to take, but the bureaucracy was just everything was bogged down in paperwork, as it says here on page 76. And so the tensions continue boiling, and there's a little small blip here in page 76, Mike Masuoka, who talks about the only way to earn the trust of Americans is to say yes, yes, and to join the military and to fight in World War II. And they do, and it succeeds. And they're able to actually win the trust of Americans, and the fact that 110,000 people, Japanese Americans, were willing to fight for America showed that they were to be trusted in society, which is crazy to think that that's the type of loyalty that needs to be shown in order to be trusted in America. And then we get to the Japanese national anthem that Papa sings um, after Papa, he tries to make his case for yes, yes to the Japanese leaders in the camp and gets into that fight. Then he sings this song, the Japanese national anthem, the Kimi ga Yo song. And in it, it's a song that's heart-wrenching for him because it's something he's saying as a schoolboy every day, every morning in Japan. And the theme of this is about endurance, is about continuing to fight through the difficulties. And so as Jean hears this song, she's, kind of in awe and sad at the way that her father is weeping over this song. And so we just see the tensions rising after living a year in Manzanar, and how just it tugs at the loyalty of people's hearts, and the fact that most of them were American citizens and treated this way was just so confusing and heartbreaking for them. So we finished part one and got to really see life in Manzanar and see how the Japanese Americans were reacting to the way that America was treating them, and we see all the emotions and tensions that have garnered up until this point. And so we'll continue chapter two or part two in the next video.